Thank you, Ilona. That was wonderful. I'd like also to thank Ilona for inviting me to participate in this symposium, to congratulate her on a spectacular exhibition. I've seen other exhibitions of Castor paintings and individual Castor paintings, and you have no idea how lucky you are to have Ilona doing this exhibition. And a final thank you to Ilona, because my own research and interest in the Castor paintings would not have been possible without Ilona, and certainly much of her research that she has done, particularly with discovering new patrons for the Castor paintings, which is of a particular interest to me. And in fact, my own interest in the Castor paintings relates to the development and transformation of colony and empire under the Bourbon regime of the 18th century, the Bourbon regime, which is to say the Spanish kings who rule Spain and Spanish America from 1700 to 1810, to broader questions of visual culture and empire. My presentation today is based on a forthcoming article which examines Castor paintings, patrons, and audiences as a way to deepen understanding of the collecting of Castor paintings, the cultural and intellectual networks within which they developed, and the polyvalence of the images. In the first part of my presentation today, what I propose to do is just to provide a very brief overview of my arguments about patrons, and then to move on to a more substantive discussion of viewer responses to Castor paintings. Ilona has argued persuasively that while elites' anxieties over loss of control, social control, and especially the porosity of racial boundaries, and the satisfaction of European desires for exotica account in part for the development of the Castor genre, they can also be, quote, interpreted as proud renditions of the local. I interpret them from another perspective, certainly not an exclusive perspective by any means. The two are perfectly complementary. Of how they may be how they may be interpreted as reflections of the construction of identity of Spanish colonial bureaucrats and ecclesiastics, as projections of Spanish imperial achievements within the broader context not only of the growing importance of scientific thought and emerging disciplines such as natural history, but also of Spain's defensiveness in the face of often vitriolic criticism from major European powers such as England and France, which portrayed Spain as a backward and declining power in the 18th century. As such, I argue that for some patrons, the Castor paintings may also be read, to paraphrase Ilona's conceptualization, they may also be read as proud renditions of empire, which convey as much about Spain's colonial resources as they do about race. The colonial subject as a racially mixed but productive cog in Spain's imperial machine as it sought to reclaim its former position of power and glory. Since many patrons were colonial bureaucrats and clergy, as agents of empire, they were sensitive to Spain's weakened position as a European power and the need for reform. Many may have recognized the importance at one level of the ideological work that paintings such as the Castor series could perform in shaping positive images of Spain and its empire. At the same time, a close analysis of several patrons and their networks reveals their interests in questions of natural history and curiosities. Some possess their own collections or aspire to, in addition to facilitating the expansion of royal and public collections in Spain. The commission and/or possession of a set of Castor paintings may be construed as a reflection and display of a patron's broader interests and self-presentation as an individual of enlightened sensibility who moved within cultural and intellectual networks inhabited by like-minded individuals such as, quote, polite naturalists and, another quote, elegant curiosos. Recent studies of natural history as a discipline have emphasized the connections between the pursuit of science and the spread of empire, and how natural history in particular could facilitate imperial expansion. Emma Sperry has suggested that natural history came to be closely associated with national pride and public utility, and that, quote, "It seems that both enlightenment and nature must be understood on several levels at once as commodity, technology, sensibility, mode of self-presentation, and social hierarchy," end quote. It is precisely Sperry's association of national history, national pride, and self-presentation that I find useful in trying to understand the attraction of the Costa paintings for many patrons. With the increasing attention to and representation of occupations in the Costa series in the second half of the 18th century, the dystopia of uncontrollable racial miscegenation and of escalating social and political conflict in the Spanish-American colonies is recast and reinvented as an orderly colonial society composed of idealized Costa subjects. If racial differences needed to be made visually explicit, so did the presence of social order, control, and economic productivity. Such idealization may also be influenced by what I referred to earlier as Spanish sensitivities to European critiques of Spain's backwardness and the need to display Spanish imperial power as exactly that, powerful and productive. I want to give you an example of the kind of criticism that Spanish bureaucrats faced in the 18th century. It's a subgenre in and of itself, and this is one of my personal favorites. This is a quote from one Major Dalrymple, who, after a trip to Spain, informed his readers, in his compilation of his observations, quote, "The progress of knowledge in this country must be very slow. There are many restrictions to retard its course. In the land of liberty, the way to science is smooth and unrestrained, but here 'tis rugged and confined. The horrid implements of arbitrary power and absurd religion interpose at each step, and those who dare encounter such difficulties and dangers will most likely sink under them," end quote. But his advice to the Spanish, new quote, "Jog on in the path of ignorance, ye unfortunate Castilians. The road to learning leads only to the knowledge of those misfortunes for which you dare not even think of a remedy," end quote. Not exactly what you want to read first thing in the morning. While the Spanish intelligentsia disagreed with many of the criticisms, they acknowledged the need for both metropolitan and imperial reform, especially in the education and training of productive subjects. Sensitive to negative images, not only was it important for Spain to participate in the scientific and intellectual developments of the period, but to display their active engagement and progress in both visual and written media. I just want to run very quickly through the conclusions. I only have time for my conclusions about my analysis of the Costa patrons. And what I basically did was choose 4 patrons and go very deeply into their careers and what we know about their interests and their networks. And I worked with a viceroy, an archbishop, a high court judge, and a merchant. The high court judge and merchant, again, were thanks to Ilona's discovery of these patrons. But I make the following arguments. First, that they provide evidence that some patrons not only facilitated the acquisition of curiosities such as Costa paintings for the Spanish monarch's collections and scientific institutions such as the Gabinete de Historia Natural or the Natural History Museum in Madrid, but that they also possessed their own collections, however modest they may have been. And important here, I think, is Chandra Mukherjee's observation that, quote, "It was in accumulating goods that people displayed their tastes. Collectors' items were part of an active communication system of objects just as subtle as written language. With them, people marked their relative social locations and defined the socio-political universe in which they moved," end quote. Secondly, the examination of the networks of these patrons not only reveals the varying levels of personal and professional engagement with collections and curiosities and with questions of colonial reform and development, but also their placement within local and transatlantic networks and association with like-minded individuals, and which facilitated conversations about the latest discoveries, curiosities, and collections. And here what was very interesting to me was the overlap and the constant reiteration of individuals speaking to other individuals who knew other patrons through memberships in academies and societies, which provided another conduit of connections and exchanges, both direct and vicarious, meetings, correspondence, publications in scientific journals. Through such linkages, patrons could navigate colonial, metropolitan, and cosmopolitan intellectual networks through a variety of friendships, memberships, professional association, which linked places such as Madrid, Malaga, Cadiz, Edinburgh, Paris, Mexico City, London, and Lima. And it was precisely through such conduits that discussions about the collectible and the curious traveled. Third, the networks within which these patrons moved also illuminate not only how knowledge about curiosities may have circulated, but ways in which the Costa paintings and other artifacts, for that matter, moved from one owner to another or from place to place. Aside from a primary commission, individuals could acquire a Costa painting or series through bequests, gifts, or through purchase at estate sales. I want to shift now to the more substantive part of my discussion on display and audiences, and to address what is a very complicated question of exhibition spaces and audience response to Costa paintings. Regardless of what patrons and artists may have intended Costa paintings to convey, viewers naturally responded to them according to their own points of reference and context. While much remains to be learned about viewership of the Costa paintings, fragmentary evidence suggests that audience responses varied from enthusiastic appreciation to studied skepticism and criticism. So, who aside from the painters and the patrons saw these paintings, where and with what mode of display? What can we say about the reviewers' reactions, if anything? Given the cultural milieu and mania for collections and collecting in the 18th century, opportunities for the exchange of information about curiosities and the viewing of such collections did not depend solely on the existence of a public museum or gallery. So we can think about the display of these paintings in official public and quasi-public spaces, museums, universities, high-ranking officials' residences such as viceroys and archbishops' palaces, and unofficial quasi-public spaces, which is to say private collections in an individual's home opened up to limited public viewing. Now, I do have a discussion about the Mexican context, but I don't want to risk David's 2-minute file being thrust at me, so we may be able to get back to it, but I do want to move on to where I have the most substantive information, which is exhibitions and viewers' responses in Spain. The main public space where Costa paintings could have been viewed by a wider audience was, of course, the Natural History Museum in Madrid. And by the beginning of the 19th century, at least one Costa series was exhibited in the Gabinete and accessible to a wider public. An English traveller's account provides evidence of viewing the Costas in situ at the Gabinete. Richard Phillips described his visit to the Gabinete in 1803 as follows, and this is a long quote, so bear with me. In the evening, we visited the Gabinete de Historia Natural. It is a collection of great interest, as it contains from Spanish America and the Manillas curiosities which cannot be possessed by any other museum in Europe. Among the other rarities are immense snakes from the Orinoco, extraordinary fish, curious birds, virgin silver and gold, specimens of the pottery of the ancient Peruvians, highly curious, some representations of idols, rude but very much in the Egyptian manner, particularly several vessels on the exterior parts of which are the images of deities exactly like the Canopus pots of Egypt, models of pagodas, Chinese boats, extremely beautiful, a Japanese drum, the most sonorous I ever heard, apparently he had a go at it. Peruvian cloth and pictures of the intermarriages of the Spaniards and Indians with the offspring to mark the gradations of color. And then he finishes by commenting on Moorish ornaments, gold rings, necklaces dug up at Grenada, and Chinese and Japanese dresses and models, end quote. The possibility of viewing Custer paintings in private houses in Spain is illustrated by another English traveler's experiences, Richard Twiss. His is earlier, and in fact, his journey through Spain and Portugal occurred in the 1772 to 73. And he makes the following comment. In several houses in the seaport towns of Spain, I observed paintings of the different colored races of beings, which are produced by the Spaniards intermixing with the Indians in America. And under the paintings were inscribed the names of those races. I caused the inscriptions, which are under 16 pictures I saw in Malaga, to be copied. They are as follows, though they may appear somewhat unintelligible. And it will be very difficult to prove the truth of what is therein advanced. And then he has 16 racial mixtures, which are very familiar, which I'm not going to read out to you. But he concludes by saying, this remarkable circumstance of the children of almost white parents, as specified in the 10th and 16 races being quite black, was confirmed to me by Don Antonio de Ulloa at Sevilla. But as I cannot pretend to demonstrate it, I leave it as I found it. Ilona, could we just have that first? If it's coming. Yes, it is. But this is the Berroeco one. I think it's on this one here, on the right-hand side. I'm glad I asked you to.
Can we have the next one on the right, please? On the left.
Well, oh, is that what it is? Yeah. Here. Yep. Well, wait, let me finish. We can get it. But anyway, there are two slides somewhere in there that show very clearly a Spanish man and an albino woman, and the offspring of the child being black. Twiss epitomizes the scientific networks which I have tried to express in my discussion, and which I develop much more substantively in my article. Twiss himself was a fellow of the Royal Society and is plugged into all of these academic networks. He was also an amateur botanist and had applied his interests to landscape and garden design based on what he termed scientific principles grouped according to Linnaean classes and orders. So it was very interesting for me to think about the lens and the gaze through which Twiss would have been examining these images. And it is, in thinking about the implied reactions of these observers, what, is something going on I don't know about? Shall I just keep going? All right, okay, yeah. No, this is like an undergraduate class. Everyone will look at the images. It's irrelevant what I'm saying. Significant in these accounts are the implied reactions of the observers. Phillips exudes appreciative, if somewhat indiscriminate, enthusiasm. His response conveys what Peter Mason has described as how, quote, the detachment of the fragment from one cultural setting and its display in an entirely different one was accompanied by an enhancement of the symbolic efficacy of the object. This exotic quality of the object in a collection of curiosities was contagious, for if every object on display was a curiosity, each of the objects might be supposed to be equally curious. This leveling effect of the presentation was an elevating one which tended to make everything more rather than less exotic. Twiss, however, reads the painting's racial taxonomies carefully, ponders them, and finally displays skepticism towards the so-called truth claims of the racial paintings, or the racial mixtures depicted, despite discussions with a renowned authority such as Antonio de Ulloa, who was one of Spain's foremost scientists. Finally, I do want to comment on a response from a Creole in Mexico, one Dr. Andrés Arce y Miranda, who in his Noticias de los Escritores de la Nueva España commented on a series of Casta paintings. Arce y Miranda was very much offended by these paintings, which he knew would be shipped to Spain. And he passed on his observations to another Creole intellectual, Juan José de Guiara y Eguren, who was gathering materials for a very famous work, the Biblioteca Mexicana, published in 1755, which was a strident refutation of any inflammatory claims about the inferiority of Creoles, Spaniards born in the New World. Arce y Miranda suggested that Eguiara y Eguren could discuss the castas and racial mixture so that people could be made aware of the purity of the blood of the literate Creoles, in order to challenge prevailing assumptions in Europe that the Creoles were all of mixed blood, which only contributed to a dismissal of their works and writings. Arce y Miranda's responses demonstrate that not everyone found the Casta paintings interesting, appealing, or amusing. He criticized them on the grounds that they would, quote, send to Spain that which damages us, from which we will not benefit, that which dishonors us, not that which ennobles us, as with the mixture of peninsular blood with Indian or Creole blood. Far from clarifying the confusion of races, the Casta paintings only contributed to such confusion and misrepresented the Creole population of Mexico, the very antithesis of their alleged purpose. His solution to this affront, interestingly, rather than suggesting the entire concept of depicting racial mixtures be scrapped, he suggested that only Spaniards and Indians and their racially mixed offspring be depicted, but not those of blacks. Whether he conveyed this to the painter is unclear, even though he evidently viewed a Casta series in the presence of the painter, who had to explain to him the meaning of the racial category albarazado. And I didn't even ask, but so never mind. But interestingly enough, the painter, possibly Berrueco, defined an albarazado not explicitly in racial terms, but in geographical terms. He described him as coming from the place of Alvarado, a place close to Veracruz. Arce y Miranda's reactions reflect the deepening sensitivities of Creoles. At the very same time that they sought to document their intellectual and cultural achievements by distancing themselves from the Casta population, the Casta paintings countered such distance by incorporating them as an integral component of the visual display of America's racially mixed inhabitants and colonial subjects. In so doing, they acted as powerful reminders of an unequal colonial relationship and of Spain's ability to shape representations of its colonial subjects. As such, they provide an early example of the controversial nature of the visual representation of race. If for Arce y Miranda, Casta paintings signified a form of calumny, for others they could represent images of colonial resources and subject populations, and simultaneously be acknowledged as objects worthy of collection. Thank you.